Hey guys, tonight we step into the somber, macabre, and surprisingly social world of the medieval execution. The overlooked civic ritual of every township, the public theatre of justice, and perhaps the only occasion where nobility, traders, and common folk would gather to contemplate mortality as equals. It wasn't merely punishment, it was where law, fear, and an unsettling sense of celebration converged under the watchful gaze of heaven itself. Before we begin our journey back in time, consider taking a moment to like this video, and subscribe if you find value in these historical nighttime tales. I'd love to know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now, adjust your lights lower, perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle white noise, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've trudged through a winding street that smells like a blend of horse manure, wood smoke, and yesterday's rain. It's early morning, so everything is still damp, including the hem of your only good tunic. You're anxious, curious, and you've nearly been knocked aside by a cart full of onions twice. You're about to witness something you modern eyes have seen. Just how do you find an execution in a medieval town? There are no printed programs, no formal invitations. What you do have are your ears. Just follow the murmurs. Somewhere past the baker's shop and the blacksmith's clanging hammer is a steady stream of townsfolk, all moving with purpose toward the central square, their voices a mix of solemn whispers and inappropriate excitement. And there it is, a wide open space normally used for markets and festivals, now transformed into something altogether more somber. The wooden scaffold stands in the centre, its raw timber still showing pale against the weathered cobblestones. Welcome to the execution ground. The perimeter is already thick with onlookers, and as you approach, the low rumble of 100 conversations washes over you like a tide. Instantly, the strange perfume of unwashed bodies, nervous sweat, and street vendor foods hits your face like an invisible wall. The execution won't begin for another hour, but the best spots are already taken. The crowd is a living entity, shifting and swelling as more people arrive by the minute. There are no reserved seats, no orderly queues, and no sense of personal space. This is a medieval execution, and it only comes in one setting: crowded. You spot an opening near a wooden cart offering a slightly elevated view, but someone else eyes it at the same time. There's a brief, awkward standoff before you reluctantly yield the spot. Someone nearby is explaining to their child why this event is happening. Another is making inappropriate jokes to hide their discomfort. A mangy dog weaves through the forest of legs, hunting for dropped food scraps. And this, friend, is just the beginning. You've only just arrived, and already the weight of what you're about to witness settles on your shoulders like an invisible cloak, part dread, part morbid fascination. As the crowd grows around you, the morning fog begins to lift. Sunlight breaks through in pale shafts, illuminating dust motes and the occasional exhaled breath still visible in the cool air. The scaffold stands empty for now, a stage awaiting its reluctant performer and masked director. The gallows rope sways gently in the morning breeze, or perhaps it's just a trick of your anxious mind. But what strikes you most isn't the execution apparatus, or the press of bodies, it's the atmosphere. A medieval execution's mood is less somber than you might expect and more unnervingly festive. The top notes are anticipation, a strange electric energy that passes from person to person like a contagion. Beneath that, fear, not just for the condemned, but a deeper recognition that there but for fortune goes any one of us. Add a hint of religious dread, the mumbled prayers of the devout, and a whisper of inappropriate excitement, and you have a blend no modern gathering has captured. The boundary between justice and entertainment blurs in ways your modern sensibilities find disturbing. Yet here you stand, just as curious as everyone else. Children dart between adults, playing improvised games while their parents discuss the criminal's alleged deeds in hushed tones. An old woman sells small loaves of bread from a basket, calling out her wares as if this were any market day. Young men debate the executioner's skill with the same enthusiasm they might discuss a tournament fighter. A bell tolls somewhere in the distance, its deep resonance momentarily hushing the crowd. All heads turn toward the narrow street leading from the town jail. The waiting is almost over. The execution is about to begin. And still, despite the strangeness of this scene to your modern sensibilities, there's something recognizably human here. The medieval execution ground is alive with the full spectrum of human emotion and social ritual. It's raw, unfiltered, and completely honest. The medieval version of public discourse minus the comfort of distance and with 400% more immediate consequence. You find your place in the crowd, feet already aching. It's uncomfortable. It's probably disturbing. But for now, you're part of this moment in history, about to witness justice as it was understood by your ancestors. The bell's final echo fades, but the anticipation it triggered lingers in the air like morning mist. You've found your spot in the crowd, but how did you come to be here? Let's step back a few hours to when this day began for you. Not as a spectator, but as someone about to become part of a centuries-old ritual of justice and spectacle. Dawn broke with a reluctant glow over the rooftops of the town. You stirred from sleep earlier than usual, despite having stayed up late discussing the day's coming events. The impending execution has been the talk of every tavern, market stall and household for weeks. Not because executions are rare, they happen with unfortunate regularity, but because this one involves someone known to many. A thief who stole from the church treasury, they say. Or perhaps it was a murderer who took a merchant's life in a dispute over debts. Or maybe a woman accused of witchcraft after a nobleman's child fell mysteriously ill. The stories vary depending on who's telling them, growing more elaborate with each retelling. What matters is that someone will meet their end today and the town will watch it happen. You dress more carefully than usual. Not in your finest clothes, those would be impractical in the press of a crowd and might attract cut purses, but in something respectable. This is, after all, a public event with social dimensions. You'll see neighbours, guild members, perhaps even the local priest. To dress too poorly would suggest disrespect for the solemnity of justice. To dress too finely would seem callous, as if attending a festival rather than a death. You break your fast with a hunk of yesterday's bread dipped in watered ale. Your stomach feels uneasy, though whether from anticipation or apprehension you can't quite say. Through the small window of your dwelling you can already hear the town stirring to life earlier than normal. Footsteps hurry past. Voices call out greetings tinged with unusual energy. "Will you be going?" your neighbour asks as you step outside, though the question is merely formality. Everyone goes to executions. It's part duty, part entertainment, part communal ritual. To miss it would raise eyebrows, spark whispers. Are you squeamish? Do you perhaps sympathise with the criminal? Or worst of all, do you think yourself above the common affairs of the town? Of course, do you answer, and together you join the stream of people already flowing toward the town centre. News of the execution has travelled beyond your town's walls. As you walk, you notice unfamiliar faces among the crowds. Farmers from outlying villages who've travelled since before dawn, merchants from neighbouring towns who've timed their visits to coincide with the spectacle, even a handful of well-dressed travellers who must have journeyed from the nearest city. An execution, especially one of note, draws crowds like a fair or a holy day. The streets narrow as you approach the centre of town, forcing the growing crowd to press closer together. The smell of unwashed bodies intensifies, mingling with the aromas of the town itself. The tang of the tanner's yard, not quite masked by burning herbs, the warm, yeasty scent from the baker already at work, the sharp bite of manure from a passing cart. A group of children dash past, laughing and playing at hangman's games with disturbing accuracy, clearly having witnessed the real thing before. "I heard the executioner once took 3 strikes to sever the head," says someone behind you, their voice pitched low but clearly meant to be overheard. "Left the poor soul screaming between blows." "That's nothing," counters their companion. "My cousin saw a burning in the London where the flames went out halfway through. They had to relight the pyre while the heretic still breathed." These gruesome tales pass through the crowd like currency, each person adding their own embellishment before passing them along. Part of the ritual, this sharing of execution lore establishes a peculiar kind of community, those familiar with death's public face and those about to become so. Vendors have set up along the route, seizing the opportunity presented by the gathered crowd. A woman sells small meat pies from a tray hanging from her neck, their greasy warmth tempting in the cool morning air. A man hawks ale in crude cups, promising it will steady your nerves for the showing. Another offers crudely printed pamphlets describing the condemned's crimes in lurid, often exaggerated detail. People buy them eagerly, those who cannot read asking others to share the sensational contents aloud. They say the town council wanted to postpone because of the spring fair next week, a man in a baker's apron confides to those around him, but the sheriff insisted justice couldn't wait. The real reason, though unspoken, hangs in the air. Executions draw crowds, and crowds spend money. The town's coffers and merchants' purses both benefit from a well-attended death. The press of bodies grows tighter as you near the square. Guards in the town's livery stand at intervals, pikes held vertically, more for show than actual crowd control. They look bored, having done this many times before. One yawns openly, leaning on his weapon. Another shares a joke with a pretty girl who giggles nervously behind her hand. The bell tolls again, closer now, its resonance vibrating in your chest. This is no church bell calling the faithful to prayer. It's the justice bell, rung only for executions and proclamations of law. Its sonorous tones carry weight, authority, finality. Someone jostles you from behind, nearly sending you sprawling into the mud. No apology follows. In this crowd, personal space is a forgotten luxury. You regain your footing and press onward. The noise grows louder with each step, and hundreds of voices all speaking at once create a wall of sound punctuated by occasional shouts, laughter, even snatches of song. A child sits perched on her father's shoulders, eating a honey-sweetened bun while gazing wide-eyed at the gathering crowd. You wonder briefly if she's too young for such an event. But the thought passes quickly. Children here grow up with death as a neighbour, not a stranger. From slaughtered livestock to plague victims to public punishments, mortality is not hidden away but displayed as part of life's fabric. "They're bringing him out soon," someone ahead calls back. A ripple of excitement passes through the crowd like wind through a wheat field. The smell changes subtly as you near the square. Wood smoke mixes with the scent of freshly cut timber. The scaffold was repaired or rebuilt recently, ensuring it wouldn't collapse under today's weight of justice. Some say the condemned had to help build it, a final humiliation before death, though this might be just another embellished tale. You pass beneath the shadow of the town hall, its stone facade watching impassively over the proceedings. The windows above are filled with faces, clerks, officials and their families afforded the best views by virtue of position and privilege. They sip from cups and chat among themselves, a private audience to the public spectacle below. The square opens before you, and there it stands, the scaffold, the gallows, the execution platform. The sight stops your breath for a moment, not because it's unexpected, but because of what it represents. This simple wooden structure, built by ordinary carpenters with ordinary tools, stands as the thin boundary between civilization and chaos, between law and disorder. Today it will take a life in the name of protecting many. You've arrived. The journey through town has transformed you from an individual into part of something larger, a congregation of witnesses, a human testament to consequence. As you find a place to stand and wait for the grim procession to begin, you wonder briefly what brought everyone else here. Duty, curiosity, entertainment, justice. The answer, like so much of medieval life, is complex and contradictory. The crowd continues to swell around you. A hot pie is thrust into your hand by a passing vendor. You pay without thinking, your eyes fixed on the empty scaffold. Someone nearby is taking bets on how the condemned will meet their end, bravely or breaking down in tears and pleas. Another speculates on whether the soul of the soon-to-be executed will ascend to heaven or plunge downward. The wait continues, but not for long now. Soon the main actor in today's grim theatre will arrive, escorted through these same streets you've just traversed. You settle in, feet already aching from standing as the crowd's murmur rises to a dull roar of anticipation. The tolling bell has drawn you here to this open space that serves as the town's heart and its conscience. You've found your place in the crowd, shoes muddied from the journey, shoulder pressed against strangers who share only this moment with you. Now let's look around at where you stand. Not just any patch of earth, but a stage carefully set for the drama of justice and mortality. The execution ground isn't simply a spot chosen at random. It's a space rich with meaning, history, and practical consideration. In the earliest medieval times, executions often happened wherever was convenient, outside the town walls, at crossroads, or near the scene of the crime itself. But as society grew more structured, so too did the rituals of punishment. Towns began designating specific locations, places that would become embedded in local memory as sites where justice, harsh and final, was dispensed. This square where you stand has likely witnessed hundreds of deaths over generations. The cobblestones beneath your feet, worn smooth by countless markets and fairs, have absorbed the blood of thieves, murderers, heretics, and sometimes the innocent. They tell no tales, these stones, but if they could, what histories they would share of fear, of courage, of cruelty, and occasionally of mercy. At the centre stands the scaffold, a structure both simple and profound in its purpose. Today's platform appears relatively new, its timber still showing pale against the weathered surroundings. It's elevated about 6 feet off the ground, high enough to ensure visibility for the crowd, but low enough for the condemned to climb without excessive difficulty. The steps leading up are steep and narrow, a final challenging journey for legs often weakened by imprisonment and fear. The design isn't accidental, every element serves both practical and symbolic functions. The height ensures that all can witness justice being done, fulfilling the primary purpose of public execution to serve as deterrent and warning. The openness of the platform makes escape impossible and resistance futile. The sturdiness of construction prevents any collapse that might interfere with proceedings, a mishap that could be interpreted as divine intervention or an ill omen. Some towns maintain permanent execution structures, typically in larger cities where such events occur with greater frequency. These might be stone platforms with fixed gallows or dedicated spaces where temporary scaffolds can be quickly erected. In smaller communities like this one, the structure is assembled for the occasion, then dismantled afterward, though always with an eye toward future use. Waste not, want not, even in the business of death. Look closer at the scaffold itself and you'll notice certain refinements. The trapdoor for a hanging is precisely cut and hinged, designed to open cleanly when the lever is pulled. The upright posts for the gallows have been sanded smooth, not for the comfort of the condemned, but to prevent splintering of the rope. The executioner's block, if beheading is planned, sits centrally, angled slightly for drainage, and with shallow grooves carved to cradle the neck. These are the careful touches of a craft perfected through grim repetition. Around this central stage, the crowd arranges itself with an instinctive understanding of social geography. The positioning isn't random, but follows unwritten rules as rigid as any court protocol. Closest to the scaffold stand the officials, the sheriff, magistrates, guild leaders, and other prominent citizens. Their proximity to the event signifies their authority and their role as witnesses to the enforcement of law. They stand straight-backed, solemn-faced, embodying the weight of civic responsibility. Behind them, in a rough semicircle, stand the middling sort, merchants, craftsmen, respectable householders. They maintain a dignified distance, close enough to see clearly, but separated from the crude enthusiasm of those further back. Some have brought their older children, pointing and explaining in low voices, an education in consequence. The outer rings belong to the common folk, servants, labourers, and the poor. Here the atmosphere is more openly festive, with louder commentary and occasional laughter. Jokes pass from mouth to mouth, some nervously crude, others surprisingly insightful. These people know hardship intimately. Death holds fewer mysteries for them. Their everyday lives brush against mortality with such regularity that this formalised version seems almost reassuring in its predictability. And then there are the premium spots, windows and balconies overlooking the square. Wealthy families who live around the square rent these views to other prosperous citizens, turning tragedy into opportunity. From these elevated perches, the well-to-do can observe without mingling, can participate without being touched by the sweat and smell of the crowd. Some have brought cushions and refreshments, prepared to make a day of it. A few windows frame the elegant silhouettes of ladies too delicate to attend publicly, but too curious to stay away entirely. Guards stand at intervals throughout the square, pikes or halberds resting against shoulders, expressions bored or vigilant depending on their experience. They're not here primarily to protect the condemned, whose fate is sealed, but to maintain order among the living. Executions occasionally spark unrest, especially if the criminal is popular or the crime disputed. A subtle undercurrent of tension runs through their posture, ready to respond should the crowd's mood shift from observation to participation. The weather plays its own role in this theatre of justice. Today's execution unfolds beneath a spring sky, pale blue with scattered clouds that cast moving shadows across the crowd. The air holds a chill that will burn off by midday, but for now, it keeps the worst smells at bay and the crowd relatively comfortable. Weather is never neutral in these events. Rain can dampen spirits and hasten proceedings. Summer heat intensifies the smell of unwashed bodies and makes tempers flare. Winter cold might turn an execution into a test of endurance for spectators as much as a punishment for the condemned. Different times bring different moods to the execution ground. Morning executions like this one tend toward the solemn, with the day's first light lending a certain gravity. Midday brings the largest crowds but also the most distractions as daily life continues around the edges. Evening executions carry a particular dread, with shadows lengthening and the possibility that darkness might fall before justice is complete, a deeply unsettling prospect in an age where night belongs to the devil. Listen now to the soundscape of this moment. The execution ground is never truly quiet. Even as the crowd awaits the condemned, the air fills with a complex acoustic tapestry. Underneath the general murmur of voices, you can pick out specific threads: a merchant calling wares, a baby wailing, a snatch of prayer from a cluster of the devout, the sharp laugh of someone who started drinking early. Dogs bark at the perimeter. A cart creaks as it's pushed through a narrow gap in the crowd. From a nearby church, monks chant the office of the day, their rhythmic Latin forming an unintentional requiem. Smells layer atop one another: the sweat of nervous anticipation, the yeasty breath of the ale drinker beside you, cooking aromas from nearby houses, the earthy scent of trampled ground, and occasionally, when the wind shifts, the distinct odour of fear from those who've witnessed this before and know what's coming. The execution ground is both everyday and extraordinary, a market square transformed by purpose into something more primal. The same space where you might buy cabbage on Tuesday becomes, on this day, a threshold between worlds, a place where a soul will pass from life to whatever waits beyond. Near the scaffold stands a table where the official record will be kept, a clerk with inkpot and parchment ready to document that justice was done according to law. Beside him, town criers wait to carry news of the execution's completion to those parts of town too distant to hear the crowd's reaction. Nothing happens here without becoming part of the community's shared story, its collective memory. Religious elements frame the space as well. A priest hovers near the steps to the scaffold, prayer book in hand, ready to offer final comfort. Some in the crowd clutch rosaries or small crosses, not just for the condemned soul, but for their own protection against whatever dark forces might be drawn to this moment of transition. For this square is more than just the physical centre of the town. It's a moral compass point, a place where boundaries are defined and enforced. Here is where society declares what will not be tolerated, what deserves the ultimate penalty. Here is where examples are made and lessons taught. The execution ground serves as classroom, theatre, church, and courtroom all at once. You shift your weight from one foot to the other, already tired of standing but unwilling to surrender your spot. The weight continues, but the space itself feels charged now, as if the air has grown thicker with anticipation. The crowd's murmuring swells suddenly. Heads turn towards the street leading from the jail. A drum begins a slow, measured beat. The condemned is coming. The execution ground is ready. The space has been prepared, the stage set, the audience gathered. Now all that remains is the central actor in this grim performance, and the masked figure who will usher them from this world to the next. As the crowd settles into the execution ground, their attention shifts to a solitary figure. Standing to the side of the scaffold, half shrouded in the morning mist, is the executioner. You've heard of him, of course, everyone has, but seeing him in person sends an involuntary shiver down your spine, not unlike the one you felt when you first stepped into that tavern last night, where ale and stories flowed in equal measure. But where the tavern keeper commanded respect through hospitality, the executioner commands it through fear. He isn't particularly tall nor exceptionally built. What makes him stand out is the strange air of isolation that surrounds him, as if he exists in his own pocket of silence amid the murmuring crowd. His face is partially concealed by a hood, not always black as legend might suggest, but often a deep burgundy or forest green, colours that hide but toward spouters while maintaining a certain official dignity. In some regions he might wear a full mask, in others just enough to shadow his features. The mask isn't merely for anonymity, it's a barrier between two worlds, the world of ordinary folk and the world of death. The executioner adjusts his gloves, thick leather worn smooth by the years of gripping axe handles, ropes, and the various implements of his trade. His clothing is surprisingly ordinary, practical garments of decent quality but nothing that would draw attention if not for his position. In some towns, executioners are required to wear a specific colour or symbol that marks their profession. A yellow armband, perhaps, or a particular pattern on their cloak, not out of honour but as a warning. "No one sits beside the executioner," whispers an old woman nearby, pulling her grandchild closer. "No one breaks bread with him." And she's right. The executioner occupies a paradoxical position in medieval society. He is simultaneously essential and despised, necessary for justice yet tainted by his association with death. He is the physical embodiment of the law's ultimate power, yet he lives as an outcast. In many towns, executioners and their families they dwell outside the city walls or in designated areas, separate from the general population. This isolation isn't merely social custom, it's sometimes codified in law. In parts of Germany, executioners must enter taverns through separate doors, drink from marked cups that no one else will use, and sit at designated tables. The very man who just last night might have poured your ale would refuse to hand a drink directly to the executioner, instead placing it on the counter to avoid contact. If you touch the executioner, even accidentally in the crowded square, you might find yourself rushing to a priest for blessing, or rubbing your skin with special herbs to remove the taint. Yet for all this ostracism, the profession endures, often passed down from father to son like a grim inheritance. Executioner families form their own small communities, intermarrying and creating dynasties that span generations. The Schmidt family of Nuremberg, the Sanson family of Paris. These names carried weight and professional reputation across decades, even centuries. Training begins young, with sons watching their fathers, learning the precise angle of the axe, the correct construction of a noose, the building of a pyre. They say his father served under the old king, someone murmurs from the crowd, took the heads of 30 men during the rebellion. Whether true or merely legend, such talk builds the executioner's reputation. Skill matters in this profession. A skilled executioner is quick and clean. An unskilled one, well, the stories of botched executions travel far, becoming cautionary tales whispered in taverns, much like the one where that red-faced farmer loudly recounted his cow's difficult birth. As he waits for the proceedings to begin, the executioner runs a whetstone along the edge of his axe. The sound is rhythmic, almost hypnotic. This isn't mere performance. A dull blade means suffering, and contrary to popular belief, most executioners take pride in efficiency. The tools of his trade vary by region and method. For beheadings, a heavy axe with a wide blade, or in more prestigious executions, a sword slimmer and requiring more skill. For hangings, ropes of specific thickness, carefully knotted and measured. For burning, torches kindling arranged just so. Each tool is maintained with professional care, cleaned after use, stored properly, treated almost with reverence. The night before an execution, the executioner follows his own private rituals. Some pray, asking forgiveness for the duties they must perform. Others drink to steady their nerves, though never enough to impair their skills. Some fast, others feast. Many speak to the tool they'll use, whispering to the axe or sword as if it were a partner in the coming dance. These rituals are rarely spoken of, but passed down within the profession like secrets. For his services, the executioner receives payment from the town or lord. The fee varies widely. A beheading might command more than a hanging, a noble's execution more than a common thief's. In some regions, the executioner is allowed to take the clothing or personal effects of the condemned, a practice that adds to their feared reputation. Others receive annual stipends plus fees per execution. It's rarely enough to live well, which is why many executioners practice secondary trades. "He mends bones too," says a thin man to your right. "Fixed my son's arm last winter. Has a touch with herbs." This isn't unusual. The executioner's intimate knowledge of anatomy often makes him a de facto healer in communities lacking proper physicians. They set broken limbs, pull teeth, lance boils, and even deliver babies in some cases. Some are permitted to practice as skinners or tanners, disposal experts for dead animals, or even as rudimentary surgeons. These secondary occupations provide additional income but further cement their status as untouchables, necessary but impure. The executioner's home reflects his status. It often stands apart, sometimes marked with symbols of his trade, perhaps an axe or noose carved above the door. Inside, it might surprise you with its ordinariness. A hearth, simple furniture, perhaps religious icons for protection. What would stand out are the tools, carefully arranged, and possibly books. Executioners are more likely to be literate than the average medieval person, needing to read sentences and keep records. Some maintain logs of their work, clinical descriptions of executions performed, methods used and results obtained. Superstitions swirl around these men like mist around a gallows. People believe an executioner's touch can heal certain ailments, particularly seizures or skin diseases. The rope used in a hanging is thought to bring luck to gamblers. The hand of an executioner is said to cure warts if he touches them while reciting specific prayers. Some believe eating bread baked by an executioner's wife can cure fevers. These beliefs exist alongside the fear and revulsion, creating a complex web of avoidance and occasional seeking out. The executioner now moves to check the scaffold one final time. His movements are deliberate, professional. He tests the block for stability, ensures the drainage channels for blood are clear. No detail is too small. A professional takes pride in thoroughness, whether brewing the perfect ale or ensuring a clean death. Beyond executions, many in this profession serve as torture experts, extracting confessions or information when required by law. They become skilled at applying pain without causing death, knowing precisely how much pressure breaks a finger but not a spirit, how long to apply the hot iron to maximize agony while keeping the subject conscious. This aspect of their work further sets them apart from ordinary society, deepening their isolation while making them indispensable to the machinery of medieval justice. Historically, some executioners achieved a measure of fame or infamy. Franz Schmidt of Nuremberg kept a detailed journal of his 361 executions and numerous torture sessions, a document that survives today as a chilling record of 16th century justice. Charles-Henri Sanson of France would later become known for executing King Louis XVI during the French Revolution, proving that even kings ultimately answer to the executioner's blade. Jack Ketch of England became so notorious for botched executions that his name became synonymous with bungling and incompetence. As the officials begin to gather and the crowd's murmurs intensify, the executioner stands perfectly still, a calm centre in the storm of anticipation. His face betrays no emotion, not eagerness, not reluctance, not even boredom. He has done this before, he will do it again. For him, this is neither sport nor cruelty. It is simply his function. Like the tavern keeper serves drinks, the blacksmith shapes metal, and the farmer tends crops, the executioner deals in death. It is his craft, his burden, and his livelihood. Children point and adults whisper, but none approach him. The space around him remains empty, a physical manifestation of his place in society, essential yet apart, visible yet unseen, human yet somehow other. In this moment before the condemned arrives, he is both the most important and the most ignored person in the square. Such is the paradox of the medieval executioner, the hand of justice that no one wishes to touch. The executioner has taken his position. The crowd hushes momentarily as officials begin to gather, and a tension settles over the square like morning fog. But what happens next depends entirely on the crime committed, the status of the condemned, and the traditions of the region. The method of execution is not chosen randomly. It speaks volumes about medieval society's values, its understanding of justice, and the delicate hierarchy that governs every aspect of life, much like the unspoken rules that dictated who sat where in the tavern the night before. Hanging, the common end. Most condemned souls meet their end at the end of a rope. Hanging is the workhorse of medieval execution, relatively simple, cost-effective, and available anywhere sturdy timber can be found. As you look toward the gallows, you notice it's sturdier than it first appeared. The structure resembles a heavy door frame or an incomplete house, usually built from oak or another hardwood that won't crack under sudden weight. The construction of a proper gallows is no haphazard affair. The crossbeam must be high enough to ensure the condemned's feet don't touch the ground, yet low enough for the crowd to witness the event clearly. The uprights are sunk deep into the earth, sometimes secured with stone foundations for permanent structures. In towns with frequent executions, the gallows stands as a permanent reminder of law and authority, weathering in the elements like the worn sign of a favoured tavern, though inspiring decidedly different sentiments in passers-by. "They rebuilt this one last spring," whispers a townsman beside you, gesturing upward. "The old beam cracked during the triple hanging after the mill robbery." Triple hangings. Such events are rare but remembered, entering local lore much like tales of legendary drinking contests or remarkable bards. What the average onlooker doesn't appreciate is the grim calculations behind a hanging. The executioner must consider the weight of the condemned, the strength and elasticity of the rope, and the height of the drop. These factors determine whether death comes quickly from a broken neck or slowly through strangulation. In early medieval times, most hangings were the latter. The condemned was simply hauled upward by the neck, feet dangling, to kick and twist until oxygen deprivation claimed them, a process that could take agonizing minutes. A process that could. By the later medieval period, the short drop method had evolved in some regions. The condemned would stand on a cart, ladder, or stool which would then be removed, creating a drop of few feet. This improved the chances of unconsciousness coming more quickly, though still not ensuring the mercy of a broken neck. The rope itself is a specialised tool, typically hemp, neither too rigid nor too elastic, and waxed to ensure the knot slides properly into position beneath the left ear. The noose contains between 8 and 13 turns, the number sometimes invested with superstitious significance. Common mistakes in hanging are the stuff of nightmares told around tavern fires on dark nights, ropes that break, sending the half-dead prisoner crashing to the ground, knots that slip, requiring multiple attempts, or worst of all, miscalculations that leave the condemned conscious, but strangling for long minutes, a spectacle too gruesome even for hardened execution crowds. Unlike the tavern keeper who might be forgiven a spilled ale, the executioner's mistakes are unforgettable and sometimes dangerous, as angry crowds have been known to turn on bunglers. The symbolism of the noose extends beyond its practical function. To hang is to be suspended between earth and sky, neither here nor there, a visual representation of the criminal's expulsion from the community of the living. The height of the gallows elevates the punishment literally and figuratively, making it visible to all, a public spectacle of justice served. Beheading, the noble death. While commoners swing from ropes, those of higher birth or special status typically meet the axe or sword. As you look to the other side of the execution ground, you notice a solid wooden block sits ready, somehow more ominous in its simplicity than even the gallows' stark frame. Beheading is generally reserved for nobility, knights, or sometimes common citizens granted the mercy of a quicker death for services rendered or bribes paid. The difference between sword and axe beheadings is significant in both technique and status. The sword is considered more honourable, requiring greater skill and typically reserved for nobility of the highest rank. The executioner who wields a sword must be exceptionally skilled. The blade, lacking the weight of an axe, requires perfect aim and strength to sever the neck in a single stroke. Such executioners are rare and command higher fees, much like how a master brewer might charge more for his special ale than the tavern's regular offering. The executioner's axe, by contrast, is a brutal but effective tool. Its heavy wedge-shaped blade delivers tremendous force, relying more on weight than on sharpness alone. The axe head is often quite large, sometimes weighing up to 7 pounds, with a cutting edge between 8 and 12 inches wide. The handle is typically around 3 to 4 feet long, providing leverage for a powerful swing. Even so, a skilled strike is essential. The neck vertebrae are surprisingly resistant, and a poorly aimed blow might strike the jaw or shoulder instead. The block itself is crucial to the procedure. Made from a solid section of hardwood, usually oak, it features a curved depression to cradle the condemned's neck in the proper position. Some blocks include handholds for the prisoner to grasp, supposedly helping them remain still, though in reality offering more psychological comfort than practical assistance. The condemned kneels before the block, extends their neck, and in their final moments stares at the straw-covered ground soon to receive their blood. Unlike a tavern's dirt floor covered in straw to soak up spilled ale, the execution ground's straw serves a grimmer purpose. My grandfather saw the Duke of Essex beheaded, boasts a well-dressed merchant nearby, as said the executioner was brought specially from London and practised on sheep for 3 days before. And such preparations weren't uncommon for high-profile executions. An execution of nobility was a political event as much as a judicial one, and botched beheadings could have serious repercussions. Famous beheadings punctuate medieval history like refrains in a tavern song. Anna Boleyn was granted the mercy of a sword and a skilled French executioner. Sir William Wallace faced the axe before being drawn and quartered for treason. These deaths become more than the punishments. They become historical landmarks, lessons in power, and sometimes martyrdom. The criteria for a clean death by beheading set a high standard. Ideally, a single stroke should completely sever the head. The executioner aims for the space between the third and fourth cervical vertebrae, where the spine is most vulnerable. A clean cut is considered merciful and demonstrates the executioner's skill, bringing him respect despite his otherwise reviled position. The condemned's head, once separated, is typically held up for the crowd to witness, proof of death and a warning to others who might consider similar crimes. Burning at the stake, purification by fire. The third method chills the blood in a different way. Near the edge of the square, away from both gallows and block, stands a thick wooden post surrounded by stacked kindling and firewood. This is where heretics, witches, and those who have committed crimes against God rather than merely against man meet their end. The construction of a pyre is more complex than it might appear. At the centre stands the stake itself, usually 8 to 10 feet tall and buried deep enough to support weight without toppling. Around this, dry kindling is arranged in a circular pattern, with larger logs stacked against this base. Sometimes a small platform is built a foot or so off the ground, allowing the wood to be stacked beneath the condemned as well as around them. Surprisingly, the goal is often a quick, hot fire, rather than a slow burn. Contrary to popular belief, most authorities preferred the condemned to die quickly from smoke inhalation before flames consumed the body. The process follows a solemn order. The condemned is led to the stake, their hands bound behind or around the post. In some regions, a small bag of gunpowder might be tied around the victim's neck, a merciful addition intended to hasten death when the flames reach it. Before ignition, the condemned is typically given a final chance to confess, recant heresy, or admit witchcraft. Many do, hoping for the mercy of strangulation before burning, sometimes granted as a concession to the truly penitent. "They say the smoke takes them before the flames," murmurs an old woman, crossing herself. "God willing." Whether this common belief offered comfort to either spectators or the condemned is uncertain, but it speaks to the human need to find mercy even in the most merciless of punishments. Burning holds powerful symbolic meaning in medieval justice. Fire purifies, consuming sin along with flesh. For crimes like heresy or witchcraft, this purification represents not just punishment but spiritual cleansing, removing corruption from both the individual and the community. The public nature of burning reinforces its role as spiritual theatre, the faithful witness evil being literally consumed by divine fire. The spectacle of burning differs markedly from other executions. There is the crackle of flames, the rising smoke that sometimes chokes the crowd if the wind shifts, and depending on the executioner's mercy or lack thereof, sometimes the screams. Unlike in the tavern where the crackling hearth brought comfort against the evening chill, here the flames serve a darker purpose, casting wavering shadows across pale faces in the crowd. Drawing and quartering the traitor's end. For the darkest crimes, high treason against the monarch or state, an even more terrible fate awaits. Though rarer than other methods, drawing and quartering represents the ultimate public demonstration of state power. The mere whisper of this punishment sends shivers through the crowd, stronger than the bite of winter wind that made you seek the tavern's warmth the night before. The full process is designed not just to kill, but to utterly destroy. The condemned is typically dragged to the execution site on a hurdle or wooden frame, rather than allowed to walk. This is the drawing portion, though in some interpretations drawing refers to the later disembowelment. Upon arrival, they face hanging, but not to completion. They are cut down while still conscious. Still alive, the traitor is laid upon a table where disembowelment occurs, the removed organs burned before their still living eyes. Next comes beheading, followed by the division of the body into 4 quarters. These quarters, along with the head, are then parboiled and displayed at prominent locations throughout the realm, often city gates, bridges, or town squares. "My father travelled to London and saw the head of Sir Hugh Despenser on London Bridge," says a traveller, his voice hushed despite the years that have passed since that particular execution. Said the birds had taken the eyes, but they'd tarred the head to make it last longer. Such displays could remain for years, grim reminders of the fate awaiting those who betray their sovereign. The political significance of drawing and quartering cannot be overstated. Reserved almost exclusively for treason, this punishment makes a spectacle of dismemberment, symbolising how the traitor's betrayal tears apart the body politic. By displaying the quartered remains across the kingdom, authorities ensure the message spreads far beyond those who witnessed the actual execution. The traitor in death serves the state one final time as a warning. Notable historical cases include William Wallace of Scotland, Hugh Despenser during the reign of Edward II, and many others whose dramatic ends were recorded in chronicles and remembered in folk memory. These executions became significant political events, sometimes drawing crowds from miles around, people travelling as they might for a fair or festival, though for a much grimmer spectacle. Breaking wheel and other methods. Beyond these main forms of execution, regional variations abound across medieval Europe. The breaking wheel, particularly common in Germany and France, stands as one of the more elaborate methods. The condemned is tied spread-eagle to a large wooden wheel, mounted horizontally on a post. The executioner then uses an iron hammer or bar to strike the victim's limbs between joints, breaking bones methodically. Finally, the shattered body is woven through the spokes of the wheel, which is then mounted on a pole for display. Death comes slowly from shock, dehydration, or exposure. The wheel itself is a marvel of grim craftsmanship. Typically borrowed from a wagon or cart, it must be sturdy enough to withstand both the binding of the prisoner and the force of the blows. Some specialized execution wheels were reinforced with iron bands and featured notches or gaps positioned to expose limbs at precise striking points. As execution methods evolved through the medieval period, regional differences became pronounced. In maritime regions, drowning served as a practical alternative, with the condemned weighted and cast into harbours or rivers. The depth of water required careful calculation. Too shallow, and the victim might find footing; too deep, and death came too quickly for proper public display. Pressing, or peine forte et dure, developed as a coercive measure against those who refused to plead in court, eventually becoming an execution method in its own right. The condemned would lie beneath a wooden board loaded gradually with stones until crushing pressure caused death. In parts of Scandinavia and the Baltic, exposure remained a traditional punishment, with criminals bound and left to the elements until nature claimed them. Boiling was reserved for especially heinous crimes like poisoning, with the condemned immersed in heated water, oil, or lead. The expense of fuel made this method uncommon, except for the most notorious cases. One particular English law in 1531 specifically prescribed boiling for poisoners, a direct response to a case of a cook who had poisoned 17 people. The evolution of execution methods throughout the medieval period reflects changing attitudes toward justice, efficiency, and what constituted humane punishment. Early medieval executions tended toward the straightforward, hanging and beheading predominated. As centralized authorities strengthened, more elaborate methods developed, emphasizing the theatre of punishment. By the late medieval period, concern for the condemned's spiritual state began to influence methods, with quick death sometimes considered a mercy allowing proper last rites. As you survey the different implements arranged around the execution ground, the gallows, the block, the stake, the wheel, you realize that each represents not just a method of death, but a complex statement about crime, status, and power. Unlike the tavern where all might drink from similar mugs, though at different tables according to their station, here the very manner of one's death speaks volumes about their place in the intricate hierarchy of medieval society. The executioner moves now between these stations, checking each with professional care, much like the tavern keeper might inspect his barrels before opening for the evening. But while one man prepares to deliver drink and comfort, the other readies himself for a far darker service, though both in their way are essential to the functioning of the medieval town. The crowd's murmurs grow louder. The officials take their places. Soon the condemned will arrive, and one of these methods will transform from possibility to grim reality. The methods of execution stand ready, tools of justice waiting silently in the morning light. But before the final moments arrive, a carefully choreographed sequence of events must unfold, a solemn ritual as codified as any church ceremony, as traditional as the brewing methods that produced last night's ale. For execution is not merely death, it is theatre, ceremony, and public statement wrapped in the trappings of justice and tradition. The condemned's final journey began long before you arrived at the execution ground. Their last night on earth was spent in conditions that varied dramatically, depending on status, crime, and local custom. For most, the night passed in the town jail, typically a dank, windowless chamber beneath the town hall or court building, far less welcoming than even the most questionable tavern room. There, lying on straw often as soiled as that beneath the tavern's drunkest patrons, the condemned faced their final hours. For common criminals, this last night might be solitary and Spartan, bread, water, and a darkness their only companions. Some jailers show small mercies, an extra candle perhaps, or a final cup of wine to ease troubled sleep. But for those of higher status or those whose crimes carried political weight, the final night often becomes a more elaborate affair. A noble awaiting beheading might receive visitors, make final arrangements for property, or even enjoy a last meal approaching the quality of a tavern's best offerings. They say Lord Harwick had roast capon and 3 bottles of French wine before his beheading, whispers a well-dressed woman in the crowd. And they brought him his own feather bed from home. Whether true or simply the embellishment that so often surrounds notorious executions, such tales reflect the medieval belief that even in punishment the social hierarchy must be maintained. As dawn breaks on execution day, the prisoner's preparation begins in earnest. Guards enter the cell, sometimes accompanied by priest or monk. The condemned is often given fresh clothing, not out of kindness but tradition. Some regions provide a simple white shift, symbolizing the shroud that will soon wrap the corpse. Others insist the prisoner wear garments appropriate to their crime, a yellow tunic for traitors, red for murderers, black for heretics. Unlike the tavern where one's attire reflects personal choice and means, here clothing becomes yet another symbol imposed by authority. The transportation to the execution site forms a crucial part of the ritual. For most common criminals, this journey becomes their final humiliation. They're often placed in an open cart, hands bound, sometimes stripped to the waist regardless of weather. The cart moves slowly through town streets, allowing citizens to view the condemned and sometimes hurl insults or refuse. This journey serves as both warning and entertainment for the populace, not unlike how a particularly rowdy tavern brawl might draw spectators from neighbouring tables. "I saw him pass down Baker's Street," says a flour-dusted apprentice. "He was praying the whole way, eyes closed, didn't look at anyone." Others chime in with their own observations, each sighting becoming part of the collective experience, the community witnessing justice in motion just as they might collectively observe a festival procession, or the arrival of an important dignitary. For nobles or those granted special privilege, the journey might be more dignified, a closed carriage perhaps, or at least the dignity of proper clothing and a mounted escort. Those condemned to drawing and quartering face the most humiliating transport, often being dragged on a hurdle or sledge like an animal carcass, a foretaste of the dehumanization to follow. Upon arrival at the execution ground, the official proceedings begin. The condemned is brought before the presiding authority, typically a sheriff, magistrate, or in cases of high importance, a representative of the crown or a high-ranking noble. This official reads the charges and sentence in full detail, often from a large parchment scroll bearing official seals. The reading is performed at full volume, ensuring even those at the edges of the gathering can hear the crimes that have brought them to this spectacle. John Miller, having been found guilty of murdering his neighbour Thomas Fletcher with an axe during the night of St. Martin's Feast, and having been sentenced to death by hanging according to the laws of this shire, shall now face the king's justice. The formal language and precise detailing of the crime serve multiple purposes. They legitimise the execution as the outcome of proper legal process, rather than arbitrary violence. They inform the gathered crowd, many of whom may know only rumours about the case, and perhaps most importantly, they create a record, spoken aloud before witnesses, that becomes part of the community's memory and legal history, much as tales told in taverns become part of local law. After the reading, tradition in many regions allows the condemned a final opportunity to speak. This moment of public address holds immense significance in the execution ritual. For some, it becomes a chance to admit guilt and seek forgiveness, potentially easing their passage into the afterlife. For others, particularly political prisoners or the wrongfully accused, it offers a final platform to proclaim innocence or denounce enemy. Some condemned remain stoically silent, while others deliver speeches so moving they are recorded by chroniclers and remembered for generations. "When the miller boy spoke, he was so calm," an elderly observer tells his grandchild. "Said he was innocent, but forgave his accusers anyway. Made half the crowd weep, it did." Whether such dignity in the face of death earns admiration or merely adds drama to the spectacle varies with the audience, but it undeniably adds a human dimension to what might otherwise be a coldly mechanical process. Throughout these proceedings, religious figures play a central role. Priests, friars, or monks attend the condemned, offering spiritual comfort and guiding them through final prayers and confessions. The presence of the clergy serves multiple functions, providing solace to the condemned, ensuring proper Christian passing, and sanctifying what might otherwise seem a brutal act of state violence. The Church, while opposed to bloodshed in principle, recognises execution as necessary for social order, and focuses instead on saving the criminal's soul even as the body is destroyed. The religious elements of execution vary by region and period. In Catholic areas, last rites are performed according to careful protocol. The condemned confesses sins, receives absolution, and in many cases is granted communion, though some regions deny this final sacrament to particularly heinous offenders. The priest offers prayers specifically for the dying, including the commendation of the soul. In the later medieval period, professional religious confraternities sometimes formed specifically to comfort the condemned, accompanying them from prison to execution while singing hymns and carrying religious banners. "The brothers of mercy are with him," someone notes, pointing to the hooded figures surrounding the prisoner. "They'll ensure proper burial afterward." And these confraternities, unlike the reviled executioner, earn respect for their willingness to extend Christian charity to society's most rejected members. Different faiths handle execution rituals according to their own traditions. In Jewish communities, rabbis might visit condemned Jews to hear confession and offer prayers, though executions were rare under Jewish law. In areas under Islamic influence, such as medieval Spain, Cadiz judges ensure proper procedure according to Sharia, with religious scholars offering guidance from the Quran in the condemned's final hours. As the religious figures complete their ministrations, the crowd's reaction shifts perceptibly. Some kneel in prayer, others crane their necks for better views, some mock or jeer the condemned, while others maintain respectful silence. The mood resembles nothing so much as the varying responses to a bard's performance in a crowded tavern. Some engaged, some dismissive, some deeply moved, all part of a collective experience that transcends individual reaction. Civil authorities maintain a formal presence throughout. The sheriff or his deputies stand at attention, sometimes accompanied by armed guards if trouble is anticipated. A clerk records the proceedings, noting time, attendance of officials, and any significant last words or occurrences. The execution itself cannot proceed without the sheriff's direct order or signal, ensuring that state authority, not mob justice, dictates the final moment. Symbolism saturates every aspect of the execution ritual. The white hood placed over some condemned serves both practical and symbolic purposes, preventing the prisoner from seeing the final blow while representing the veil between life and death. The breaking of the execution wand by the presiding official in some regions symbolizes the breaking of the criminal's life and authority's final judgment. When nobility faces the axe, the reversing of their coat of arms signifies the end of their lineage or honor. These symbols speak a language the medieval mind understands intuitively, adding layers of meaning beyond the mere physical facts of death. As the moment of execution nears, time seems to stretch and compress simultaneously. The crowd grows quieter. The condemned is led to the specific apparatus of their death. The gallows stems, the beheading block, the stake. Final prayers are whispered. The executioner takes position, as prepared and focused as any craftsman about to demonstrate their skill, though his art brings death rather than the conviviality of the tavern keeper's brew. The moment of execution itself follows specific protocols. For hanging, the sheriff gives the signal, the lever is pulled or the cart driven away and the body drops. For beheading, the condemned kneels, places their neck on the block, and the executioner waits for their subtle signal, often a raised hand or nod, before swinging. For burning, torches are applied to the pyre simultaneously from different sides. Each method has its timing, its unwritten rules understood by all professionals involved. And in that moment when life ends, a strange tension releases across the square. Some spectators cheer, some weep, many cross themselves. The community has collectively witnessed justice as they understand it. Harsh perhaps, but necessary in a world where law must be visibly enforced to maintain order. Unlike the tavern's nightly rhythms of drinking, singing, and eventual stumbling home to sleep, this gathering disperses differently, marked by the solemnity of having stood at the threshold between justice and violence, between law and death. The documentation of the execution continues after the final breath. The clerk notes the time of death. The sheriff confirms the sentence has been carried out. In some regions, physicians examine the body to verify death. Records are filed with courts or church authorities, becoming part of the legal archive. Medieval societies, though lacking modern bureaucracy, maintain surprising thoroughness in documenting executions, understanding that proper record makes the difference between justice and mere killing. And so concludes the complex ritual of medieval execution, a ceremony where religion, law, tradition, and theatre converge in a public display of authority's ultimate power. Unlike the warmth and revelry of the tavern where you sought comfort the previous night, the execution ground offers a colder form of communion. Yet both spaces serve essential functions in medieval society, one building community through shared pleasure, the other through shared witness to the consequences of violating community norms. The crowd begins to disperse, the official ritual complete. But for many, the experience of execution will continue in conversations at market stalls, in prayers at evening mass, in nightmares or reflections on mortality, and yes, in tales told over ale in the same tavern, where last night's stories revolved around more pleasant themes. The ritual may end, but its echo continues, rippling through the community like a stone cast into still waters. As the condemned's final moments approach and the executioner readies his tools, it's time to look beyond the scaffold itself to the sea of faces surrounding it. Why are they here? What draws thousands of souls from their beds at dawn to witness another's final breath? The answer lies in the complex tapestry of medieval social psychology, where punishment is not just justice but spectacle, education, and even entertainment. The crowd around you pulses with a strange energy. A woman in a simple linen cap clutches her young son's hand tightly, whispering something in his ear as she points to the condemned man. A nobleman sits atop his horse at the edge of the square, watching with detached curiosity. Two apprentices who clearly abandon their morning duties elbow each other, sharing a flask and making wagers on how many axe strokes it might take. A priest prays audibly, his Latin phrases floating above the general murmur. The purpose of these gatherings isn't accidental. Public executions serve as living, breathing deterrents against crime. Let all who would do likewise witness the price, the bailiff often proclaims before the sentence is carried out. The authorities want you to watch. They want you to remember. They want the image of the hanging man or the severed head to burn itself into your memory, to awaken in your nightmares when temptation crosses your path. The theory is simple. Witness the consequences, avoid the crime. As you observe the somber procession, the reading of charges, and the methodical preparations of the executioner just as he tested the edge of his axe earlier, you're meant to experience a vicarious punishment. The medieval justice system literally performs its power, writes its authority in blood and finality, and demands your attention as witness. "I brought my son to see," whispers the woman beside you, noticing your gaze. Nothing teaches better than this. No sermon, no switch across the knuckles. Her boy, no more than 7, stares wide-eyed at the scaffold. She's not unique in this thinking. Children are common sights at executions, brought by parents who consider the spectacle educational. Today's young observers learn their society's boundaries in the starkest terms possible. What's most striking, though, is how the execution blends solemnity with festivity. The same crowd that falls silent during the reading of the sentence laughs moments later at a drunkard stumbling through the square. A group of young women share bread and gossip while waiting for proceedings to begin. Much like at the tavern last night, where serious negotiations and frivolous games happened at adjacent tables, the execution ground is both sacred and profane space. This duality reflects medieval attitudes toward death itself. In a world where plague might sweep through town tomorrow, where childbirth claims 1 in 3 mothers, where winter hunger is an annual visitor, death isn't hidden away or made in a bowl. It's acknowledged, integrated, even occasionally mocked. The execution is merely death made formal, death given purpose and structure in a world otherwise full of random mortality. Last hanging I attended, the rope broke. A leathery-faced man tells anyone who'll listen. Took it as a sign from God they did. Let the poor wretch go free. Others nod, but a sceptical baker's wife rolls her eyes. That was 30 years ago, and in another town entirely. My father's cousin knew the hangman. He used a weak rope on purpose, got paid by the family he did. Tales like these circulate through the crowd like coins through the market. Some speak of executioners who tortured their victims unnecessarily, others of condemned men who died with such dignity they seem transfigured into saints. Public executions generate stories, and stories build cultural memory. Through these shared narratives, the community processes the violence it has collectively witnessed. What you're experiencing isn't just punishment, but theatre. The execution follows a script known to all present. The procession, the prayers, the final words, the moment of death. Each element carries symbolic weight and follows established tradition. Even the executioner's movements contain a ritualistic quality, a somber choreography practiced through generations. It's a performance intended to restore moral order, to heal the wound that criminal behaviour has inflicted upon society. You notice how different social classes experience the execution differently. The nobles watch from windows of buildings surrounding the square, or from horseback at the edges, maintaining literal and figurative distance from the proceedings. Merchants and guild members stand in the middle ground, while the poorest labourers and beggars press closest to the scaffold, competing for the best views. Where you stand in the crowd reflects where you stand in medieval society. This stratification extends to behaviour as well. While labourers might shout insults at the condemned or cheer at the executioner's efficiency, the wealthier observers maintain composed expressions, discussing the proceedings in hushed analytical tones. The execution, like the tavern, the church, and the marketplace, reinforces the social order even as it unites the community in shared witness. "He was caught stealing from the Duke's orchard," says someone behind you. "Just 3 apples for his starving children." "He broke the law," replies another voice firmly. "Order must be maintained." This tension between justice and mercy ripples constantly through the crowd. Everyone brings their own judgment to the judgment. Some see righteous punishment, others excessive cruelty, depending on personal sympathies, social position, and understanding of the crime. The execution becomes a mirror, reflecting each observer's values. Not all executions generate the same atmosphere. A condemned murderer who confesses and shows remorse might elicit prayers and sympathy from the crowd. Convicted witch or heretic could spark fearful murmurs, and the protective Satanist finding of crosses. A notorious highwayman might be secretly admired, his execution watched with conflicted emotions. The crowd's reaction forms another layer of judgment atop the official one. Authority figures understand this emotional complexity. That's why execution rituals are carefully managed to maintain control of the narrative. The formal reading of crimes, the presence of religious and civil officials, the structured program of events all work to legitimize the punishment and direct the crowd's response. Nonetheless, public sentiment remains unpredictable. "I saw a hanging once," an old woman tells her grandchild, "where the crowd turned against the executioner. They believed the man innocent, you see. Started throwing stones, they did. Guards had to escort the hangman away for his own safety." Damn, such stories aren't uncommon. Public opinion, even in strictly hierarchical medieval society, holds power. Authorities fear the mob's judgment nearly as much as criminals fear official judgment. This fragile balance occasionally tips into outright intervention. Historical records describe instances where crowds stormed scaffolds, cut down hanging bodies, or attacked officials to prevent executions they deemed unjust. These rare cases remind rulers that public punishment requires public consensus to function effectively. Without it, the deterrent becomes discord. The execution ground also serves as a release valve for social tensions. Just as the tavern provides space for harmless revelry that might otherwise become disruptive, the execution offers controlled expression of darker impulses. Violence, voyeurism, judgment, revenge — these human drives find sanctioned outlet in the public square rather than erupting unpredictably elsewhere. The execution both reinforces authority and provides safety measures against its collapse. As you watch the proceedings unfold, you notice how the crowd's mood shifts with each stage. Anticipation builds during the arrival of the officials. Solemn attention falls during the reading of charges. Tension thickens as the condemned mounts the steps. A collective held breath as the executioner raises his axe, then that strange, complex release after the blade falls. Part gasp, part sigh, part morbid satisfaction. This emotional journey is shared by hundreds, sometimes thousands, creating a form of communion through witnessed death. "Better him than me," mutters someone nearby, a phrase repeated at executions throughout history. This sentiment captures the psychological distance observers create between themselves and the condemned. By witnessing punishment happen to others, medieval people reinforce their own sense of righteousness, their own security within the moral and legal boundaries of society. Each execution silently proclaims, "The system works, the guilty are punished, the innocent are safe." Yet this comforting narrative isn't universal. Others in the crowd might identify with the condemned, seeing themselves in the same desperate circumstances that led to crime. For them, the execution is less reassurance than warning. Poverty, bad luck, or false accusation could place anyone on that scaffold. The same event simultaneously reinforces some viewers' sense of security, while deepening others' awareness of vulnerability. Children experience executions differently than adults. For them, the spectacle often overwhelms the moral lesson. They watch with a mixture of fear, fascination, and confusion that will shape their understanding of justice and authority throughout life. Their presence creates a generational continuity in public punishment. Today's wide-eyed child becomes tomorrow's knowing adult, explaining to their own children why the axe must fall. "When I was your age," a father tells his daughter, "I saw the execution of the traitor Baron Wolfort. Still remember the silence after they read his crimes. You never forget your first." The girl nods solemnly. Her expression suggests she won't forget this day either. This inheritance of witnessed justice extends beyond individuals to community identity. Towns become known for particular executions or punishment traditions. Places where infamous criminals met their end become landmarks incorporated into local law. By the old hanging tree remains a navigational reference long after the tree itself has disappeared. The execution transforms physical space, imbuing it with historical and moral significance that persists through generations. As noon approaches and the execution concludes, you notice how the crowd disperses in clusters, processing what they've witnessed through conversation. Some head directly to taverns like the one you visited last night, where ale and animated discussion will help digest the morning's events. Others return silently to work, carrying the experience internally. Priests gather those seeking spiritual reassurance. Mothers answer children's questions in hushed tones. The execution continues to reverberate through social interactions hours after its conclusion. The psychic impact varies widely. Regular attendees of executions often develop a certain callousness, discussing technical aspects of the executioner's performance as casually as they might critique a blacksmith's work. First-time witnesses frequently experience more profound reactions: nightmares, loss of appetite, obsessive retelling of what they saw. For some, witnessing death becomes morbidly traumatizing. For others, once is more than enough. What you've observed today extends beyond punishment into the complex ecosystem of medieval social control. The execution ground serves simultaneously as classroom, theatre, church, and marketplace. It reinforces hierarchies while creating temporary community. It deters crime while sometimes glorifying criminals. It demonstrates power's reach while occasionally revealing its limits. As you join the thinning crowd leaving the square, stepping carefully around discarded food scraps and patches of dirt darkened by spilled blood, you carry with you not just the memory of one person's end, but a deeper understanding of how medieval society maintains its boundaries, processes its fears, and performs its values. The condemned has lost their life, but in doing so has inadvertently strengthened the social bonds between those who witnessed their final moments. The execution, like the tavern where tales of it will soon be exchanged over steaming mugs, serves as both mirror and window, reflecting society back to itself while offering glimpses into the darker chambers of human nature. And as the scaffold fades from view behind you, the complex psychology of what you've witnessed continues to work through your thoughts, just as it has for countless witnesses throughout the medieval world, binding communities together through the shared experience of sanctioned death. As the crowd disperses, their reactions ranging from somber reflection to grotesque excitement, your attention turns to the figure at the centre of this theatre of justice. Before they became a spectacle, before they climbed those wooden steps to meet the executioner and his meticulously maintained tools, the condemned was a person, with fears, hopes, and a final journey unlike any other. The types of criminals facing execution span the spectrum of medieval society. The majority are common thieves, murderers, and violent criminals from the lower classes. Poverty drives many to steal. Desperation turns arguments deadly. Then there are political prisoners, rebels, traitors, those who whispered the wrong words about the wrong noble. Religious criminals form another category: heretics, blasphemers, and supposed witches whose ideas threatened the church's authority. Each type faces their end differently, based on their crime and their station. "That one didn't weep," notes a woman beside you, pointing to where the execution just concluded. "Stood proud, he did. Not like the baker who stole flour last month. That one begged until the very end." Her observation highlights how differently individuals approach their final moments. Some collapse in terror, some maintain dignity, some embrace martyrdom, and others retreat into a strange calm that witnesses often mistake for bravery. Social status profoundly influences how one experiences condemnation. A nobleman convicted of treason might spend his final night in reasonably comfortable quarters, receive visits from family, and have access to writing materials for final letters. Nobles are typically permitted to retain their dignity even in death, wearing fine clothes to the execution, receiving the quicker death of beheading rather than hanging, and often being granted private moments with a priest for confession. In stark contrast, a common thief might spend their final hours in a filthy dungeon, chained to other prisoners, without comfort or privacy for their final thoughts. They would be marched to the gallows in rags, perhaps already weakened by torture used to extract confessions. The condemned commoner becomes a public example first, a human being second. My brother knew a man who attended the Duke of Suffolk's execution, an older man in a merchant's cap tells his companions as they walk past you. Said he wore velvet to his beheading, addressed the crowd like he was giving a sermon from the pulpit, even tipped the executioner a gold piece for a clean stroke. The small group nods appreciatively at this display of aristocratic composure in the face of death. The condemned's preparation for their end follows different paths. Spiritual readiness consumes many of their final hours. Priests visit frequently, offering confession, communion, and promises of divine mercy despite earthly punishment. Even the most hardened criminal often seeks reconciliation with God when facing imminent death. Medieval society sees execution not just as physical end, but as the gateway to potential eternal punishment, a prospect far more terrifying than the axe or noose. Some seek more practical preparations. Those permitted pen and paper write farewell letters, settle debts, make final requests for their survivors. A surprisingly common concern involves ensuring their body receives proper Christian burial rather than the dishonourable treatment often reserved for executed criminals. Others focus on their final public moments, planning speeches or gestures that might preserve their memory or reclaim some dignity from their disgrace. The tradition of the last meal varies widely across medieval Europe. In some regions, it's a symbolic gesture, a final act of mercy before punishment. In others, it's almost sacramental, echoing Christ's Last Supper. The meal's quality reflects the condemned status. A knight might receive wine, fresh bread, and roasted meat. A common thief might get only a crust of bread and water. Some refuse food entirely, either from nausea brought by fear or as a final act of defiance. They say Lady Eleanor Cobham fasted 3 days before her burning, whispers a woman in a fine wool dress to her companion, wanted to meet her maker with a pure body. Whether true or embellished, such stories circulate widely, becoming part of the mythology surrounding famous executions. Final requests beyond meals reflect individual priorities in their last hours. Some ask to wear specific clothes, either their finest garments or simple penitent attire. Others request religious symbols to hold during their execution. A few seek forgiveness in person from those they've wronged. Many simply wish for quick, clean deaths, slipping coins to the executioner as you saw earlier, hoping to purchase mercy in the form of a sharp blade or properly calculated drop. The words spoken from the scaffold, whether whispered prayers or bold declarations, often become the most remembered aspect of any execution. Medieval chronicles preserve many such utterances, though embellishment certainly colours the records. Some classics echo across centuries. "Be not afraid of them that kill the body," quotes a convicted heretic, embracing martyrdom. "I die the king's good servant, but God's first," proclaims a principled counsellor. Others are simpler, pleas for mercy, assertions of innocence, or calls for loved ones. Not all final words are profound. Some condemned babble in terror or confusion. Others remain stubbornly silent, denying the crowd their expected performance. A few use their final moments for dark humour. "This will cure my headache," jokes one nobleman before his beheading. Each approach reveals something about how individuals face their mortality when it stands directly before them, in the form of an executioner and his awaiting tools. "I attended the execution of the pirate Jenkins," a sailor tells anyone who'll listen at the edge of the square. "Laughed at the hangman, he did. Told the crowd his only regret was not stealing more. Some cheered him for it." Such defiance sometimes transforms criminals into folk heroes, remembered long after more penitent souls are forgotten. The psychological state of the condemned fascinates observers. Some seem almost absent from their own executions, their minds retreated to unreachable places. Others appear hyper-present, noticing details, engaging with the crowd, even directing aspects of the proceedings. Many alternate between terror and resignation, their emotions as unsteady as the scaffold beneath their feet. A peculiar calmness sometimes descends on those who have exhausted their fear during long imprisonment. They walk to death with a tranquility that unnerves witnesses. Rarely but memorably, execution day produces the strangest of all outcomes: survival. Ropes break. Executioners miss their mark, fires mysteriously extinguish. These cases force authorities into difficult decisions. Some view survival as divine intervention, a sign that God has overruled earthly justice and grant pardons. Others simply schedule a second attempt, viewing failure as mere technical difficulty. These half-hanged or twice-tried individuals become local legends, their stories retold in hushed voices in taverns for generations. "My grandmother swore she saw a hanged man start breathing after they cut him down," says a young apprentice. Guards had already left. His family spirited him away in a cart covered with hay, lived another 20 years in the next county over. Whether truth or tavern tale, such stories reflect the uncertainty that sometimes surrounds even this most final of punishments. Women face execution less frequently than men, but experience distinctive treatment when condemned. Pregnant women receive temporary reprieve until their children are born. The innocent should not suffer for the mother's crimes. Women accused of witchcraft or infanticide face particular public hatred, their executions often drawing larger, more hostile crowds. Conversely, women condemned for killing abusive husbands sometimes generate sympathy, with petitions for mercy circulating among local women. Executioners themselves often admit to discomfort when dispatching female criminals, reflecting complex gender dynamics even in this most extreme exercise of justice. They had to drag the Mitchell woman to the stake, an older woman recounts quietly, not because she struggled, but because she collapsed entirely. Couldn't stand from fear, the executioner wept before lighting the pyre. Terrible business all around. The crowd listening to her grows uncomfortably silent, the festive atmosphere of earlier momentarily dispelled. The question of post-mortem redemption occupies many medieval minds. Can a properly contrite criminal, despite their earthly punishment, still achieve heavenly reward? The Church's answer is cautiously affirmative. Sincere repentance, even at the final moment, opens the possibility of salvation. This belief drives the persistent presence of priests at executions, offering last rites until the very end. Some executed criminals become objects of local veneration, their remains thought to possess healing properties or their execution sites drawing pilgrims seeking favours. For nobles and clergy, an entirely different system often applies. Benefit of clergy allows those who can demonstrate literacy, primarily clerics but also educated nobles, to claim exemption from secular courts for their first offence, usually receiving more lenient punishments from ecclesiastical authorities. This creates a two-tiered justice system where a nobleman's crime might result in a fine or penance, while the same offence sends a commoner to the gallows. "The bishop's nephew killed a man in a tavern brawl," grumbles a stonemason to his companions. "Recited a psalm, proved he could read, and walked free with a branded thumb. My cousin stole a loaf in winter and swung for it." This disparity breeds resentment that occasionally erupts into broader social unrest. As you reflect on what you've witnessed today, you realize the condemned serves multiple roles in medieval society: criminal, penitent, example, entertainer, and ultimately sacrifice. In their punishment, communities reaffirm boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable behavior. In their suffering, others find deterrence or catharsis. In their final moments, some find redemption, while others embrace defiance until the end. The condemned person, before becoming merely another execution statistic, experiences a journey both intensely private and brutally public. Their crime, trial, imprisonment, and eventual punishment unfold as personal tragedy and communal spectacle simultaneously. And as you turn away from the now empty scaffold, where the executioner is cleaning his blade, you understand that each execution connects the intimate experience of individual mortality with the broader social functions of justice and order. Whether commoner or noble, penitent or defiant, man or woman, each condemned person walks their final path alone, yet surrounded by witnesses. Their stories, whispered in taverns, recorded by chroniclers, embellished through retellings, remain long after their physical forms have disappeared from the execution ground, becoming part of the complex tapestry of medieval memory and morality. The final moments have passed. The executioner's blade has fallen or the rope has drawn tight. The condemned has completed their journey from criminal to corpse, but the story of a medieval execution doesn't end with the last breath of the condemned. What follows, the handling of the body, the dispersal of the crowd, the ripples through the community, reveals as much about medieval society as the execution itself. As the crowd begins to thin, their varied reactions still playing across their faces, just as you observed earlier, the executioner and his assistants approach the body with practiced efficiency. Their work is far from complete. The handling of an executed criminal's remains follows protocols as strict and symbolic as the execution itself, though these vary widely based on the crime, the criminal's status, and regional tribunal traditions. For common criminals executed by hanging, the body might remain suspended for hours or even days, a grim reminder to all who pass by. The creaking of the rope, The slow turning of the body in the wind becomes part of the town's soundscape, a macabre public service announcement about the consequences of crime. Eventually, the executioner's assistants cut it down, often unceremoniously letting it drop to the ground with a dull thud that seems to echo through the now emptying square. "They'll leave that traitor's head on the bridge gate for 6 months, remarks a leather worker, nodding toward a recent beheading victim. "Saw the ravens take the eyes from the last one. Nature has its own justice, doesn't it?" His companion makes a sign against evil, uncomfortable with such observations, despite having cheered during the execution itself. Burial practices for executed criminals exist on the margins of sacred tradition. While medieval Christians believe strongly in proper burial for the journey of the soul, those who die by execution often receive compromised rites. Many are buried in unconsecrated ground near the execution site or in specially designated areas at the edge of cemeteries, neither fully included in nor completely excluded from the community of the dead. Some executed bodies face post-mortem punishments that extend their sentences beyond death. Traitors' bodies are quartered, their parts dispatched to different regions of the kingdom, head to the capital, limbs to places where their treasonous activities took place. Witches' ashes are scattered rather than buried, symbolically preventing any return. Particularly notorious criminals might be gibbeted, their bodies placed in iron cages hanging in public places, allowing decay to occur in full view, sometimes for years. My grandfather remembered the highwayman Moore hanging in chains outside the North Gate, an elderly man tells his grandson. Said the creaking of that iron cage in the wind kept people awake in the nearest houses. When a storm blew through, they'd hear the bones rattling inside. 15 years it stayed there, until nothing remained but a few scraps and stains. For the more fortunate, those whose families have influence or wealth, redemption might be possible even after death. Relatives petition for proper burial, sometimes offering substantial payments to officials or the church. A noblewoman whose husband was executed for treason might spend her remaining fortune ensuring his quarters are reunited and interred in the family tomb. A guild might protect the memory of a member executed for a crime they believe unjust, secretly retrieving the body for proper burial under cover of darkness. As the body is dealt with, the crowd itself undergoes transformation. The collective entity that witnessed justice now fragments back into individuals carrying their experience into the wider world. Some linger, examining the empty scaffold or the ground where blood soaked into the earth. Others hurry away, suddenly eager to distance themselves from death now that the spectacle has ended. Many head directly to taverns like the one you visited last night, where ale flows and tongues loosen. "I tell you, the face he made at the end, I'll not forget it," says a man clutching a mug near the tavern hearth, his expression caught between fascination and distress. Didn't think his neck would stretch that far. His companions nod, some adding details from their own observations, others disputing minor points. The execution is already becoming story, its reality blurring at the edges even hours after it occurred. Souvenirs and relics from executions form another strange aspect of their aftermath. Despite official disapproval, an underground market exists for items associated with certain executions. A piece of rope from a famous hanging, a splinter from a notorious burning stake, even cloth dipped in blood. All might be purchased by those seeking mementos or believers in their supposed magical properties. Executioners themselves sometimes participate in this trade, supplementing their income by selling items they are uniquely positioned to obtain. "My mother kept a thread from the rope that hanged the witch Bertha," confides a middle-aged woman to her friend as they walk from the square. "Said it protected the household from curses. Kept it in a pouch above our door for 20 years. For public officials, the execution's aftermath involves documentation and accounting. Records must be kept, expenses tallied. The executioner submits his bill, itemized by service rendered, from the initial restraints to the final disposal of the body. Clerks note the completion of the sentence in official registers. The criminal's name, crime, and manner of death enter the public record, sometimes accompanied by diagrams or witness testimonies. Medieval bureaucracy tracks death with the same methodical attention it applies to taxation or land transfers. The execution ground itself requires attention once the spectacle concludes. Blood must be cleaned, ash swept up, debris collected. This task often falls to the executioner's assistants, another undesirable duty in their already stigmatized profession. In larger towns with frequent executions, the ground becomes permanently stained. the soil darkened by generations of absorbed blood. Some say such earth possesses special properties, cursed according to some, blessed according to others, but never ordinary. My grandmother would never walk across the old execution ground, says a young woman to her companion as they deliberately detour around the now empty square. Said the spirits of the unjustly killed still wander there after dark. On quiet nights, you can hear the ropes creaking without wind. Such stories represent the psychological aftermath that lingers long after physical evidence has been cleared away. Execution sites become psychic landmarks in the medieval landscape, places where the barrier between living and dead seems thinner. Children dare each other to visit them after dark. Adults hurry past while making protective gestures. The execution may end, but its ghostly echo persists in community consciousness. Those who witness particularly gruesome executions often carry the images into their dreams. A butcher's apprentice tosses in his sleep, revisiting the drawing and quartering he observed that morning. A noble woman who watched a burning from her window finds herself startling at the normal crackling of her own hearth fire. The community processes the violence it has sanctioned through these individual psychological responses, gradually absorbing the experience into its collective memory. I attended old Baron Harwood's beheading when I was just a boy, an aged carpenter tells younger workers in his shop near the square. That was, let me think, 63 years ago now. Can still recall the sound the axe made. Some things never leave you. His apprentices listen wide-eyed, the execution from decades past becoming as real to them as the one they witness today. Famous executions generate stories that outlive everyone who witnessed them. Tales grow with each retelling, the condemned's final speech becomes more eloquent, their demeanour more dignified or defiant, and the crowd's reaction more dramatic. Historical accuracy blurs, but the cultural significance deepens. Particularly noteworthy executions become reference points in communal timekeeping. It happened the winter after they burned the heretic Thomas, someone might say, dating an event through its proximity to memorable death. The impact on the local community extends beyond memory into practical reality. A village that loses several members to execution might struggle with reduced labour and fractured families. A town where an important guildmaster is executed could see economic ripples affecting many lives. Families of the executed often face ostracism, struggling to rebuild their reputations and livelihoods in the shadow of shame. Some relocate entirely, seeking places where their connection to infamy remains unknown. The miller's widow left with her children last week, a baker tells his customers while handing out morning bread. Gone to her cousin's village, 3 days' journey south. Can't blame her. No one would bring grain to her husband's mill after what happened. His customers nod understanding, though they had been among those who shunned the family of the executed man. For the executioner, the aftermath brings a return to the strange isolation you learned about earlier. Having performed his public duty, he retreats to the margins, perhaps stopping at a tavern where he drinks alone at a reserved table, other patrons maintaining careful distance. He cleans his implements, the sword, axe or ropes, with professional care before storing them for their next use. His ledger gains another entry, another name, another payment noted. Then he disappears from public view until duty calls again. Authorities measure the execution's aftermath in terms of its deterrent effect. Have other criminals been suitably frightened? Has public order been reinforced? These questions occupy official discussions in castle chambers and town halls. If crime decreases following a public execution, officials congratulate themselves on effective justice. If not, they may plan more frequent or severe public punishments, believing the message simply needs reinforcement. As days pass, physical evidence of the execution fades. Blood washes away with rain. The scaffold is dismantled or stands empty awaiting its next use. But subtler traces remain, in conversation, in nightmare, in changed behaviours. People avoid certain areas after dark. Parents use the executed criminal's name to warn children against misbehaviour. Prayers are offered for souls in uncertain spiritual territory. And so the execution completes its complex social function, extending far beyond the moment when life left the condemned's body. What began as punishment for one becomes lesson, warning, entertainment, and ghost story for many. The medieval execution, in its aftermath, continues to serve as both wound and suture in the community fabric, simultaneously tearing the social body with violence while binding it together through shared witness and retelling. The sun sets on the execution ground. The dead are buried or displayed according to their sentence. The living return to their homes carrying memories that will ripple through their community for generations. And the cycle of crime, judgment, and punishment prepares to begin again, an endless rhythm in the medieval world where justice is public, personal, and permanently etched into community memory. Section 10. Regional Variations, 1-500 words. As the crowd disperses from the execution ground, whispers and conversations drift through the air like autumn leaves. Some speak of other executions they've witnessed, of different methods and customs from lands they've visited, or tales they've heard. For while the condemned's body may still be warm, the traditions surrounding his death are centuries cold, varying as much as the dialects and bread recipes across the medieval world. The execution you've just witnessed is but one thread in a vast tapestry of judicial punishment, coloured differently by region, climate and culture. In the same way the tavern keeper's ale in York differs from the wine-soaked innkeeper's brew in Marseille, the manner of death dealt by authorities shifts as you cross mountains, rivers and invisible boundaries of custom. In England, where we find ourselves now, the gallows reigns supreme, a structure so common that many towns have permanent wooden scaffolds standing ominous against the sky. The English have made an art of hanging, with their calculations of drop distances that have evolved over centuries. A poorly executed hanging, if you'll forgive the grim wordplay, results in slow strangulation, while a proper one breaks the neck instantly. The executioner here prides himself on this merciful efficiency. But cross the narrow sea to France and beheading takes precedence, especially for those of higher status. The French preference for the sword over the axe is not merely aesthetic. A skilled French executioner wielding a properly weighted sword can sever a head in a single stroke, cleaner, quicker, and considered more dignified than the sometimes multiple blows an English axe might require. The scaffold is different too, lower to the ground, with the condemned kneeling rather than standing. In Paris, executions often occur at the Place de Grève, where cobblestones have been stained dark with centuries of blood. The crowd gathers differently there, more orderly, almost theatrical in their positioning. French authorities have developed an almost ceremonial approach, with precise timing and ritual that feels like a solemn play rather than a punishment. The condemned is given a moment to address the crowd, but unlike in England where these speeches might ramble, French officials keep them brief, almost like a final courtesy. Travel eastward into the German lands and the method grows more elaborate. The breaking wheel, that instrument of prolonged suffering you might have heard described in hushed tones at the tavern, finds its fullest expression here. The German executioners are known for their grim precision. Their wheels are carefully crafted, the spokes positioned to maximize both pain and public visibility. The condemned is tied to the wheel, limbs spread between the spokes, and the executioner methodically breaks each limb with an iron hammer before weaving the still-living body through the wheel's structure. It's a slow death that can last days if the authorities wish it, with the wheel then mounted on a pole for all to see. German towns often have designated places for these displays, usually at crossroads or town borders, serving as grisly signposts of law and order. Unlike the somewhat festive English crowds or the solemn French gatherings, German executions often have a heavier atmosphere, with the crowd watching in a silence broken only by the condemned's cries and the executioner's rhythmic work. In the Spanish territories, particularly as the Reconquista pushed southward, execution practices blend Christian and Moorish influences. The Spanish favour the garrote, a seated execution where a metal collar is tightened by a screw mechanism until it strangles the condemned. It's efficient, relatively quiet, and requires less space than a gallows or scaffold. But the Spanish are also known for their implementation of burning, particularly for heretics and those convicted by the Inquisition. A Spanish burning follows distinct protocols, with the condemned dressed in a sanbenito, a penitential garment painted with flames and demons. The pyre is arranged differently too, sometimes with the stake positioned so that the executioner can discreetly strangle the condemned before the flames grow too intense, a mercy hidden from the crowd but known to officials. The Spanish crowd crosses themselves more frequently, murmurs prayers, and the air feels heavy with religious significance rather than mere justice. In the northern reaches, among Scandinavian peoples, colder weather shapes execution practices. The blood eagle, more legend than common practice by the later medieval period, involved cutting open the back and pulling the lungs out to form wings, a death reserved for the most hated enemies. More commonly, northern executions take advantage of the environment, exposure to the elements, abandonment in the wild, or drowning in icy waters. The community aspect differs too, with smaller crowds but greater participation from local elders and family representatives. The Italian city-states, with their complex political structures, develop particularly theatrical executions. In Venice, criminals might be executed between the two columns at the entrance to Piazza San Marco, a location charged with symbolism. Florentine executions often incorporate elements of shame and repentance, with elaborate processions through the city before death. The sophistication of Italian politics creates executions that communicate complex messages about power, with subtle variations depending on which family or faction controls the government. Eastern European practices incorporate more superstition into their executions. In parts of what we now call Romania and Hungary, criminals convicted of particularly heinous crimes might be executed at crossroads to prevent their spirits from finding rest. Stakes are driven through corpses of suspected vampires or witches, and bodies might be buried face down to confuse the spirit. The timing of executions often aligns with phases of the moon or religious calendars, embedding cosmic significance into judicial punishment. In the Byzantine Empire, blinding rather than execution often serves as the ultimate punishment, especially for political rivals. When death is decreed, it frequently comes through sophisticated mechanisms in Constantinople, trapdoors dropping victims into the Bosphorus, specialized chambers in the Great Palace, or exotic animals in the Hippodrome. Byzantine executions carry elaborate symbolism, often inverting status symbols. A general might be hung by his own battle standards, a corrupt official strangled with chains of office. The Islamic territories across North Africa and parts of Spain observe different principles entirely. Sharia law governs punishment, with specific methods prescribed for specific crimes. Stoning for adultery follows precise protocols about stone size and the participation of witnesses. Beheading is quick, usually without the extended ceremony common in Christian lands. Public spaces transform temporarily for executions and return immediately to normal use after, without the lingering psychological charge that haunts European execution grounds. Even within regions, the divide between urban and rural executions creates stark contrasts. City executions are formal, structured, and heavily documented. Rural villages, lacking permanent scaffolds or professional executioners, improvise with available resources. A village hanging might use a tree branch, the executioner might be a reluctant local pressed into temporary service, and the ceremony cobbled together from half-remembered protocols. What the rural execution lacks in formality, it makes up for in community involvement. Almost everyone knows the condemned personally. Geography shapes method too. Mountain communities favour cliffs and ravines as execution sites, sometimes dropping the condemned from heights. Coastal towns might tie criminals to stakes on tidal flats, letting the sea become the executioner twice daily. River towns develop drowning cages, lowering the condemned into the water on a mechanism allowing for either a quick death or prolonged torture. Each community adapts the basic principles of execution to their landscape, creating a patchwork of practices across the medieval world. The availability of materials influences tradition as well. In heavily forested regions, burning predominates. In rocky areas with little timber, stoning becomes more common. The presence of a skilled metalworker might lead to elaborate iron execution devices, while regions without such craftsmen rely on rope and wood. Resource-poor areas develop methods requiring little material: suffocation, drowning, exposure. Seasons alter execution practices too. Winter executions in northern Europe are often postponed due to frozen ground preventing burial, or accelerated to prevent the condemned suffering unnecessarily in cold cells. Summer executions in southern regions might occur at dawn before the heat becomes unbearable for the crowd. Spring and autumn, with their moderate temperatures, become the high seasons for judicial death across most of Europe. As you walk away from the execution ground, your boots sticky with mud from the trampled earth, you might reflect on how the death you witnessed carries the weight of place and time. Had you been born 100 leagues east or west, had the condemned committed their crime in another kingdom, everything from the structure of the scaffold to the prayers uttered would differ, though the finality of death remains the same. The tavern will be full tonight with discussion of what transpired. Some will compare it to executions they've witnessed elsewhere. An old soldier might describe the brutal efficiency of Ottoman executioners. A merchant could recount the elaborate processions preceding executions in Florence. Each tale carries fragments of truth obscured by exaggeration and ale, yet together they paint a picture of a medieval world where justice, while universally final, speaks in many dialects. And in that tavern, As the fire burns low and voices grow heavy with drink and drowsiness, remember that the variations in death dealing are not merely technical differences. They reveal the heart of each culture, what they fear, what they value, how they understand the relationship between crime and punishment, between the individual and society, between the body and the soul. For in the end, an execution is never simply an execution. It is a statement written in flesh and blood, a performance with death as its final act, a ritual binding community through shared witness. And as you drift towards sleep tonight in that humble tavern bed, the straw mattress scratching against your neck not unlike the rope that ended a life today, remember that while methods may vary, the medieval mind across all regions shares one certainty, that justice must not only be done but be seen to be done, written on the body for all to witness, remember, and fear. As the light fades from our medieval day and you settle deeper into your tavern bench, the smell of ale and wood smoke wrapping around you like a familiar cloak, it's worth reflecting on how the execution you witnessed earlier is itself a moment in time, a practice neither static nor eternal. The methods of dealing death in the name of justice have their own history, their own evolution, like rivers carving ever-changing paths through the landscape of human civilization. The execution practices of the medieval world didn't spring fully formed from the darkness following Rome's fall. They evolved slowly, shifting with the currents of power, religion, and technology. If you could somehow witness an execution from the early medieval period, the 6th or 7th century, you would barely recognize it compared to what you saw today in our late medieval setting. In those early medieval centuries, when Europe was still finding its footing after imperial collapse, executions were simpler, often more direct affairs. Justice was frequently a local matter handled by tribal leaders or early feudal lords rather than complex state mechanisms. Hanging might be done from the nearest sturdy tree without calculation of drops or specialized nooses. Beheadings were accomplished with whatever blade was available, sometimes taking several gruesome attempts. The early medieval execution lacked much of the ceremony and ritual we now associate with judicial death. There were fewer formalities, less pageantry, and often little separation between sentence and punishment. A thief might be tried, convicted, and hanging from a branch before sunset on the same day, with only a handful of witnesses rather than the crowd that gathered for today's spectacle. As kingdoms consolidated and the church's influence grew stronger, execution began its transformation into the codified process you witness today. By the 10th century, execution practices were formalizing. Specific crimes merited specific punishments. Specialized roles developed, including the dedicated executioner. That paradoxical figure caught between necessary official and social outcast that we discussed earlier, the Church's influence on execution cannot be overstated. While ecclesiastical authorities themselves never carried out executions, the old principle that the Church abhorred the shedding of blood, they profoundly shaped how secular authorities approached death penalties. The concept of the condemned soul became increasingly central, with time provided for confession and the last rites, opportunities for repentance, and prayers incorporated into the execution ritual. By the 12th century, these religious elements had become so integrated that executions took on aspects of religious theatre. The scaffold was not merely a place of punishment, but a stage for demonstrating the consequences of sin, a physical sermon on the wages of transgression. The condemned was expected to play their part in this moral drama, to demonstrate proper contrition, to warn others away from similar paths, to affirm the justice of their sentence even as they suffered under it. The 13th century brought further refinements with the growth of legal codes and procedures. Executions became more standardized, with specific protocols developing for each method. The executioner's role grew more technical, more specialized. Hanging evolved from simple suspension to the more calculated long drop method intended to break the neck rather than cause slow strangulation. Swords for beheading were specially crafted for the purpose, heavier, and with specific balance points different from battle weapons. Tools became more sophisticated too. The scaffold you saw today, with its trapdoor mechanism for hanging, would have seemed almost magical to witnesses from 3 centuries earlier. The execution chair used in some regions for garroting featured mechanical innovations unknown in earlier times. Even the wheel had its refinements, with specialized designs developing in different German territories. But as methods grew more elaborate, a counter-movement toward mercy began stirring as well. In the later medieval period, particularly from the 14th century onward, we see the emergence of what we might call merciful modifications. small adjustments to execution methods designed to hasten death and reduce suffering, often hidden from public view. The executioner might secretly strangle a condemned person before the flames reached them at a burning. The height of drops in hanging was calculated to ensure neck-breaking rather than slow suffocation. Blades were kept sharper, executioners better trained. These changes weren't born from modern humanitarian concerns, but from complex medieval notions of good death, proper justice, and Christian mercy. Famous cases sometimes accelerated these evolutions. When Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was executed in 1541 by an inexperienced headsman who required multiple strikes to complete the beheading, the public outrage led to higher standards for executioner skill and training. Similarly, when a burning went wrong and the crowd rioted in sympathy with the suffering condemned, authorities learned to better manage both the technical aspects of execution and the crowd's emotional response. Political changes shaped execution practices too. As centralized states grew stronger in the later medieval period, execution became more standardized across regions. A hanging in York began to more closely resemble a hanging in London, as royal authority imposed consistency. The wild regional variations we discussed in our last section began a slow, centuries-long process of homogenization. This standardization extended beyond borders as well. Diplomatic exchanges between kingdoms included discussions of judicial punishment. Executioners sometimes traveled, bringing techniques from one region to another. Methods considered more humane or effective spread, while those deemed excessive or prone to public sympathy for the condemned gradually declined. By the 15th century, the foundation was being laid for what would eventually become the more humane execution methods of later centuries. Though still far from modern sensibilities, the late medieval execution showed increasing concern with efficiency and reduced suffering compared to its early medieval counterpart. This shift wasn't linear or universal. Periods of greater cruelty alternated with periods of relative mercy, but the general trajectory was established. You can see hints of this evolution in certain details of the execution you witness today. Perhaps you noticed how the executioner checked the sharpness of his blade repeatedly before the beheading, or how the priest spoke quietly to the condemned about a quick passage to judgment rather than lingering in pain. These small mercies, nearly invisible unless you're looking for them, represent centuries of gradual change. The spectacle aspect of execution, however, remained remarkably consistent throughout the medieval period. The public nature of punishment, the gathering of witnesses, the ceremonial elements, the exemplary purpose endured as a central feature. What changed was not whether executions were public, but how that publicness was managed, ritualized, and directed towards specific social goals. As our medieval day comes to a close and you mull these thoughts over your final mug of ale, it's worth considering how the practices you've witnessed would continue to evolve long after your time. The scaffold would eventually move indoors behind prison walls. The crowds would be replaced by small groups of official witnesses. The elaborate ritual would be stripped down to clinical procedure. Yet these later developments remained firmly rooted in medieval foundations. The concern with humane death, proper authorization, and clear documentation that characterizes modern execution all began forming in the medieval mind. Even the modern debate about whether the state should take life at all finds its earliest stirrings in late medieval religious and philosophical discussions. You can still visit places today that bear witness to this history. The Tower of London with its execution site on Tower Green, the old town squares of European cities where scaffolds once stood, museums housing executioners' swords and axes, now behind glass but once the final site for countless condemned souls. These physical connections to the past remind us how recent this history truly is. Some execution grounds eventually became markets or parks, the memory of their grim purpose fading with each passing generation. Others retained their dark associations, becoming places of legend, ghost stories, or tourist curiosity. The Tower of London's ghostly processions, the headless apparitions reported at countless castle ruins across Europe, these are the cultural echoes of medieval justice still reverberating today. Legal language preserves these connections too. We still speak of people facing the axe, metaphorically in corporate settings. Politicians whose careers end suddenly are said to have been guillotined, though that particular device came later than our medieval focus. When we describe something as gallows humour, we're reaching back to the foot of the medieval scaffold, where jokes were made in the face of mortality. Even our entertainment carries these echoes. When you watch a film featuring an execution scene set in historical times, you're seeing the latest retelling of what was once a common public spectacle. The fascination remains, though now safely displaced into fiction rather than enacted on actual condemned bodies in village squares. The psychology that drew crowds to executions hasn't vanished. It has merely been redirected into more socially acceptable channels. Our interest in true crime, in courtroom dramas, in fictional depictions of justice and punishment, all connect back to the scaffold, to that complex mixture of horror and satisfaction that medieval people felt watching justice enacted upon the condemned body. And so, as you drift towards sleep in your tavern bed, the straw mattress rustling beneath you with each turn, remember that the execution you witnessed today was neither the beginning nor the end of a story. It was a moment in a long continuum, a practice continuously shaped by human hands, human beliefs, and human contradictions. Our desire for justice alongside our capacity for mercy, our need for order alongside our fascination with transgression. The medieval execution ground has gone quiet now. The scaffold stands empty against the darkening sky, but its legacy continues in our laws, our literature, our language, and our collective memory, a reminder that how we punish speaks as much about us as it does about those who break our rules. And as sleep claims you at last, perhaps you'll dream not of the violence you witnessed, but of the long, winding river of human justice ever changing, ever flowing toward an uncertain future. As dawn breaks over our medieval town, the soft light filtering through the grimy tavern window finds you still wrapped in rough woolen blankets, your mind lingering on yesterday's execution. The scaffold stands empty now in the morning mist, birds perched indifferently where a man's life ended hours before. The town stirs slowly back to ordinary rhythms, bakers stoking ovens, merchants arranging wares, children splashing through puddles without thought to what those waters might have witnessed. Before we leave this dark chapter of medieval justice behind, let us pause to reflect on what we've learned about the society that built the scaffold and gathered to watch its grim work. For executions, like taverns and marketplaces, are windows into the medieval mind, revealing values, fears, and beliefs that might otherwise remain obscured by the heavy curtain of passing centuries. The public nature of medieval execution speaks to a culture that believed in witness justice. Unlike our modern sensibilities that tuck punishment away behind institutional walls, medieval people saw value in collective observation. The condemned died not just for their crimes, but as living and then dead lessons to all who watched. Justice was not abstract but embodied, written on flesh and bone rather than merely in legal documents. We've seen how execution served multiple purposes, judicial punishment certainly, but also social control, religious ritual, and even entertainment. The execution ground was where authority displayed its power, where communities reinforced their boundaries, where the condemned made their final transition from life to death, citizen to example, person to memory. Like the tavern where stories are shared, or the church where prayers are offered, the scaffold was a place of transformation. We've walked through regional variations, noting how execution methods reflected local values, resources, and traditions. The English preference for hanging, the French affinity for the sword, the German breaking wheel, but each tells us something about how different cultures understood justice, dignity, and the relationship between crime and punishment. Much as dialect, dress, and diet varied across medieval Europe, so too did the languages of judicial death. And we've traced the evolution of these practices, watching as they grew more formalized, more standardized, and in some ways more merciful through the centuries, a progression that would eventually lead toward modern approaches to punishment, though that journey lay centuries in the future for our medieval witnesses. The execution we observed stands within that river of change, neither its source nor its destination, but a significant moment in its flow. As you rise from your tavern bed, joints creaking from the hard mattress, you might find yourself wondering where else the medieval approach to justice manifested itself. If public execution was the endpoint of the judicial system, what came before it? Where were the accused held while awaiting trial or punishment? What spaces contained those deemed too valuable to execute but too dangerous to release? And so we turn our attention now from the scaffold to the shadows, from the public spectacle of execution to the hidden world of medieval imprisonment, from death delivered in the town square to life prolonged in darkness and confinement, from the executioner's blade to the jailer's key. For while execution may have been the most visible face of medieval justice, it was but one tool in a complex system of punishment and control. Tomorrow, should you choose to join us, We'll descend stone steps worn smooth by countless reluctant feet. We'll hear the creak of iron hinges and the rattle of chains echoing off damp walls. We'll feel the temperature drop as sunlight falls away, replaced by the wavering glow of torches. We'll enter the medieval dungeon, a world as distinct from our modern prisons as the scaffold is from our lethal injection chambers. While the name dungeon conjures images from fantasy tales, vast underground chambers filled with fond instruments of torture, the reality of medieval imprisonment was both more mundane and more complex. The very word dungeon comes from the French donjon, originally referring not to an underground cell but to the main tower of a castle, often repurposed to hold important prisoners. Unlike execution, which was formalised early in the medieval period, imprisonment evolved more slowly as a punishment in itself. For much of the era, confinement served primarily as a holding state, a place to keep the accused until trial or the condemned until execution or payment of fines. The concept of imprisonment as the punishment, of time itself as the penalty, would develop only gradually. You might be surprised to learn that medieval imprisonment rarely occurred in centralised facilities. Instead, a patchwork system existed: castle dungeons for political prisoners and nobles, church prisons for clerical offenders and heretics, town jails for local troublemakers, manor house cellars for peasants who violated their lord's rules. Each space had its own traditions, conditions, and purposes. Status mattered enormously in imprisonment, perhaps even more than in execution. A noble held in a castle tower might have comfortable quarters, servants, fine food, and visitors, experiencing what we might now call house arrest rather than harsh confinement. Meanwhile, a common thief might be chained in a lightless pit beneath the town hall, subsisting on bread and water brought by jailers who barely acknowledged his humanity. Unlike the public nature of execution, imprisonment happened largely beyond public view. The community gathered to watch punishment delivered, but then the condemned disappeared behind thick walls. This hiddenness created space for imagination, for rumours and tales that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The dungeon became a place of legend, a dark corner in the medieval mind where fears collected and multiplied. As you step out of the tavern into the morning air, the execution ground now quiet and ordinary in daylight, consider how these two aspects of medieval justice, the public death and the hidden confinement, reflected different facets of the same social order. The scaffold displayed power openly, the dungeon exercised it secretly. The execution taught through spectacle, the dungeon through whispered stories. Both were theatres of authority, merely performing on different stages. Look up at the castle on the hill overlooking the town, its stone walls catching the morning sun. Somewhere within those thick walls are chambers never touched by that light. While the town has watched death delivered in their square, other punishments continue unseen behind those distant walls. Other stories unfold in darkness, equally part of the medieval experience, equally worthy of our exploration. So rest now if you wish, let the images of the scaffold fade from your mind. Tomorrow we'll explore those hidden spaces, those forgotten corners where medieval justice worked not through public ceremony, but through isolation and confinement. We'll meet the jailers and their charges, learn the languages of locks and chains, and understand how the medieval dungeon, like the execution ground, was not merely a place of punishment but a complex social institution reflecting the values, fears, and beliefs of its time. As the tavern door closes behind you and you step into the flow of medieval life continuing despite yesterday's momentary pause for death, remember that every aspect of this world, from its most public spectacles to its most hidden chambers, tells us something about the people who lived in it. Their justice, harsh though it may seem to our modern sensibilities, but was woven from the same threads as their markets, their churches, their taverns and their homes, threads of order and chaos, mercy and cruelty, community and power, all twisted together into the complex fabric of medieval life. As twilight settles over our medieval town once more, and the day's activities gradually quiet into evening stillness, let us bring our journey through the somber realm of medieval executions to its own gentle conclusion. Like the condemned whose final moments we've witnessed through the lens of history, our exploration now reaches its end, though hopefully with more peace and considerably less drama. We began in the muddy streets, making our way toward an execution ground where justice would be rendered in its most final form. We felt the anticipation in the air, heard the murmurs of the gathering crowd, sensed the complex mixture of dread and curiosity that such events inspired. Together, we stood among people of all stations, from nobles watching from cushioned windows to peasants pressing close to the scaffold. We examined the execution space itself, that temporary theatre of mortality where social order was reinforced through ritualized ending of transgressive lives. We met the executioner, that paradoxical figure caught between respected official and reviled outcast. We watched as they performed their solemn duties with tools crafted specifically for efficient death-dealing. We witnessed various methods of execution, each with its own protocols, symbolism, and degree of suffering, from the relatively quick mercy of a skilled beheading to the prolonged agony of the wheel or the purifying flames of the stake. We observed the rituals surrounding death, the processions and proclamations, the prayers and confessions, the symbolic transitions from living criminal to dead example. We considered the social psychology behind public punishment, understanding how executions served not merely as justice for individual crimes, but as powerful demonstrations of authority, opportunities for community catharsis, and warnings to any who might contemplate similar transgressions. We saw how different social classes experienced these events differently, yet all were bound together by their witness. We explored the experience of the condemned themselves, their final meals and words, their spiritual preparations, their varied responses to impending death. We followed them beyond the moment of execution to examine how their bodies were handled afterward, how their memories lived on in local lore, how the execution ground itself became a place charged with meaning. Our journey took us across Europe and beyond, observing how execution practices varied by region, climate, and the culture. From an English gallows to French beheading blocks, from German breaking wheels to Byzantine blinding chambers. We traced the evolution of these practices through the medieval period, watching as they grew more formalized, standardized, and occasionally more merciful as the centuries passed. Finally, we considered the legacy of medieval execution, how its echoes still resonate in our language, our entertainment, our psychological relationship with justice and punishment. We bridged from the public spectacle of the scaffold to the hidden world of dungeons, connecting different aspects of medieval justice into a more complete understanding of how this society maintained its order. Now, as your eyelids grow heavy and your breathing slows, let these harsh medieval realities fade gently into historical perspective. The scaffold has long since been dismantled. The executioner's axe rests in museums. The crowds have dispersed into centuries of dust. What remains is our connection to these distant ancestors, not through their methods of punishment, which we have largely abandoned, but through their fundamental human concerns with justice, order, and meaning. Perhaps as you drift towards sleep, you might reflect on how fortunate we are to experience these aspects of medieval life only through stories rather than first-hand. The medieval tavern, with its smoky atmosphere and questionable stew, might charm us as visitors, but the medieval execution ground reminds us that the past, for all its fascinating differences, was not always a gentler time. Should you return to join us for another historical journey, we'll explore new facets of the medieval world, its dungeons and prisons perhaps, or its healing practices, its agricultural methods, its child-rearing customs. For now, though, rest easy in your own comfortable bed, far from the straw mattresses and scratchy woolen blankets of our medieval tavern, and even farther from the grim justice of the scaffold. Sleep well, and remember that while history can sometimes be dark, exploring it helps us better understand not just where we came from, but who we are now, and perhaps, in some small way, who we might yet become.